This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program Living Legends collection. This interview was originally conducted in the year 1972. We have no specific month or day mentioned. The interview was conducted by Mrs. Mary B. Roberts. The interviewee is Mr. Edwin Terrell, and that's Terrell Fleming, capital Fleming, of Enid, Oklahoma. This material is being re-recorded on the 29th of May, 1986 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
Our interview today is at the Youngblood Hotel in Enid with a most interesting character, Mr. Edwin Terrell Fleming. We will find that the 75 years that he has spent in Enid have been most interesting. I'm going to ask now that he give us his name, the name of his father and his mother, and anything he cares to add, we'll be glad to have it.
You want my name first? My name is Edwin Terrell Fleming, but I'm known as just plain Ed Fleming. I've lived in Enid practically all my life, having been born up in northeastern Kansas.
Your father and mother.
My father's name was Oliver Joseph Fleming, and my mother's name was Ella K. Fleming. Her maiden name was Letson, Letson, and she came from Kansas, and my father came from Missouri.
That's good. And your business has been banking and
Since I've lived in Enid, I've been in business only in two capacities. In the banking business for many years, and after that I've been in the insurance business, which business I am in today.
Mr. Fleming, we would like to know something of the change from the banking business to the insurance business. Perhaps there was an incident there that you would relate for us.
It goes back into the, I guess you'd call it the Depression of 1933, when all the banks were a little bit jittery and having trouble. And it was during this time that my father became violently ill. He had a stroke. And everybody thought then that my bank was going to go under. But I got the other three banks together, and I merged with all three of them. That's why I got out of the banking business, but nobody lost a penny except Ed Fleming. And I got out, though, in good shape and in good health and with a good name, which I was after mostly. So it was rather a unique merger. I don't know if I've ever heard of three banks taking over one before, but they did, and they all made money by it, and I was quite happy that nobody lost anything. So that's my experience in the banking business.
And now your business is insurance, I believe. Tell us something about insurance in Enid and how it's come along.
Well, I had a very dear friend in Enid who was in the insurance business, and he asked me one day, says, would you be interested in getting a contract with the Travelers Insurance Company? I said, well, I might. I'd think about it. So I went to Oklahoma City and met the men down there, and they gave me a very fine reception. So I decided to go into the insurance business, which I have been in ever since then. It's general insurance of all lines. I'll take on anybody that needs some insurance, life, accident, health, or any other, fire and theft or what have you. And
I'm sold.
that is really my line, and that's what I've been doing ever since. So it's an interesting business, and I like it, and I love it. So that's how I got in the banking. I'm in the insurance business is through this friend of mine in Oklahoma City. So that's my experience in insurance.
About how many years have you been in the insurance business?
Ever since 1933.
You went in that very year. You closed the bank and went right on into insurance.
Practically.
Now then, we want to go back as far back as you can tell us about to the very early days of Enid. Something about, for instance, what did the town of Enid look like? How many paved streets and so forth? Your square, what buildings did you have? And tell us something of the early days.
Well, the early days of Enid was, well, I don't know exactly how I want to say it, but it was quite plebeian, I guess. It was the good old days, yes, maybe you might call it that. No paving, with the horse and buggy. And I lived on the east side of town, which at that time was the only part of town to live in. That was the best part of town, in other words. We lived out about 1200 block on East Main. Today, the population is going west, but in the early days, it was mostly east. And the square was just like it is today, rather than it wasn't paved, and the dirt roads and the mud and everything that went with it. And it was interesting living.
Are there any stores now that were going at that time? It started that early?
I can't recall. Well, there've been some mergers of stores that I can recall. A clothing store here was Mybergen and Gottschalk was the name of it. And now it's the S&Q grocery. I mean S&Q clothing store. But there wasn't any Safeways during my day. In the early days. They weren't ready yet.
No supermarkets.
No supermarkets. Just plain old grocery stores. And ham and eggs is about what we ate, and chickens. They were cheap. Much cheaper than they are today, of course. But
About what did they cost then? Do you remember?
or you could get a chicken for a dime, 15 cents. Meat was, or you could get a good T-bone steak for 25 cents. And it was good, too.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. So it was interesting living, but rather plebeian, and as far as heat was concerned, we had the old kitchen stove and the stove in the living room, the base burner they called it.
Yeah.
We burned hard coal in the base burner. In the kitchen, of course, we just burned wood and coal both. But we got along, and we loved it. And as I look back, why, it wasn't so tough.
Well, life was simpler some way.
Life was very simple
We
in
do
those
have
days.
things now that we didn't have then, but we've also gotten so complex in so many things.
Life was not complex then at all. It was simple, and everybody got along with everybody else. We had few enemies. You just didn't make them like you do today for some reason or other.
Well, neighbors were neighbors.
Neighbors were neighbors, and they were good people.
Your word was your bond.
That's right. A word was your bond in those days.
I lived in those days too.
Yes.
Do you remember any particular traumatic experience of the little town as it was growing up? Any storms or fires or anything that made the citizens really get together on something?
We had our normal amount of windstorms and hailstorms and fires and droughts, but it didn't seem to bother us too much. We had no catastrophes, as I recall. So things went along.
Has Enid ever had a tornado?
Oh yes, we've had tornadoes, but we're still here. They weren't too severe, but sometimes we'd have a pretty heavy wind, and the dust was a factor though in the early days on account of the pavement being not there.
I remember that.
On account of the pavement wasn't there.
And you wore dusters to keep the dust off of your...
Yeah, my folks wore, my mother, I remember, she wore a duster all the time when she went out. And we wrapped up in the wintertime, but in the summertime we had to take it.
Yeah.
We had no coolers like we have today. We did have fans, but you propelled them yourself, and once in a while you'd have an electric fan up on top, but it's quite a little while before we had electricity.
Yeah.
And when we had electricity, why, we began to ease off a little bit.
Were the churches, did they come to Enid as the town developed? Did you have the various congregations organized and coming in?
Yes, we had various churches. I can recall probably half a dozen denominations. I belong to the Presbyterian Church up in Kansas, and of course my folks kind of founded the Presbyterian Church here in Enid, as far as that's concerned. And
what was your first church like?
well, it was rather, we did a lot of singing.
Yeah.
Probably more singing out of the hymns than they do today. But the congregation, of course, was small, and the church was small, but as the town grew, why, so did the churches, and so did the congregation.
Did they have benches or seats or?
Yeah, we had, to start with, we just had chairs, and then we progressed to benches, and then to permanent seats.
Pews.
Pews, yes.
Did you have an old organ that you?
Oh yes, we had an organ. It was an old timer, and I recall a very interesting incident as far as the organ is concerned. My sister was quite a musician. In fact, she was a very marvelous musician. She was born that way. And I got a little of it, but not very much. My mother was quite musical, so I used to pump the organ for her in church. She wasn't very strong. She couldn't pump the organ, so.
Some of those big ones, you know.
So I used to pump it from the back end. It had a handle on there, and I'd pump it for her. So one Sunday morning in church, before church, she asked me, she says, when they pass the plate around, see if you can find out what I'm going to play. It isn't going to be church music, but I want to know if you can recognize it. She could take a piece of music and do anything with it.
Yeah.
So when they were passing the plate around, I was pumping the organ and she was playing it. And when it was all over, I smiled at her and she smiled at me. And I made a signal to her as if I knew what she had played, which I did. And it turned out in the First Presbyterian Church in Enid, Oklahoma, on that Sunday morning, she played Alexander's Ragtime Band. and the prettiest church music you ever listened to.
Like a hymn.
Just like a hymn. Nobody knew it but the two of us. So that's a little church history that I'll never forget.
That's priceless. Well, as they built the new church, did you build further out, and did it, the town grow out like most of them have?
Oh yes, the town began to go west in those days, and we had a little church on the east side, but wasn't but a year or 2 or 3 years until we built another church on the west side of town, and happened to be on the same location now where the church is presently located. We built a very nice, fine church, and which it still is. It's modern in every respect.
In the ways of amusements and things in those early days, even before the picture show, usually they came maybe on Saturday nights, and then maybe 2 nights a week. And then finally, there would be one running every night. Did Enid have any other amusements, say, before the picture show?
Oh, we played a lot of croquet in the early days, and we played tennis. I remember that, and baseball. And
Was that out on the common somewhere?
yes,
Everybody
we had a park which we all congregated and played the baseball, and then we had our own tennis courts and so forth and so on. But
That's when everybody knew everybody.
everybody knew everybody else. That's right. Mm-hmm.
I think that is what makes us call it the good old days.
I expect that's
I think
a
that's
good word
it.
for it.
The women, did they play bridge all the time like we
No,
do now? Or?
no, they didn't. They didn't play bridge in those days, as I recall. That wasn't being done much.
Was it quilting
Card
parties?
playing was just a little bit taboo.
Oh, that's right, it was, wasn't it?
Just a trifle.
Was dancing also under the band?
Not so much. The dancing was rather
Well,
not
church,
like it is today.
in my church, it was very much under
It
disapproval.
was, well,
Methodist church.
it wasn't exactly under disapproval, but they dance different than they do today. And I don't know, it just kind of grew into everybody went to dances,
Were there-
more or less.
Were they kind of community dances?
More or less community.
Organized through the school or through a club or what?
No, not necessarily a community. It was just kind of the crowds would get together and like they do today and kind of pair off.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way we did it in those
Where
days.
they began.
Yes, ma'am.
Did the men play, was baseball such a,
Baseball was a big game for the boys to play, and I developed into a pretty fair ball player. In fact, I was captain of the baseball team at the University of Oklahoma, and we loved baseball in those
what
days.
year were you there?
I was captain of the baseball team at the University of Oklahoma in 1912.
My goodness, Mr. Fleming, I have no idea.
12 from 72 is about 60 years, isn't it,
Yes, it is.
ago.
And then you had Cornell after that.
Then I went to Cornell University for my senior year, that's right.
So your degree really came from Cornell.
Cornell, that's right.
What was your major?
Economics and finance.
As it was taught then, wasn't it mostly theory? Just history?
Oh, I suppose it's mostly theory. I expect it mostly is today.
True. Nobody knows what's going to happen.
No, that's true.
All they can do is judge the present by the past and guess what the future will be. Well, did you find that economic, practical and helpful to you in your switch
Oh.
from?
Not particularly, no. You just kind of hit the high spots in the books, but it didn't apply to a new country like it might today.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
My mother was quite interested in everything that was going on. She was in the YWCA and this and that and everything that was.
Well, now, Enid was a big temperance town.
Mm-hmm.
I remember reading that in an Oklahoma history, that Enid was one of the centers where the sentiment against liquor was developed. And your WCTU was organized and was very.
It was quite a factor in those days, yes.
How
And
did it happen? Was it near enough Kansas that it got it from Carrie Nation? And
well, I don't know. Somebody must have brought it in. And folks like my mother and father, I guess, were responsible for things like that. And mother was chairman of the flag committee of the DARs for the state of Oklahoma.
oh,
And Oklahoma at that time did not have a state flag.
mm-hmm.
So because my mother was chairman of the flag committee of the DARs, why they appointed her to submit a flag to the state legislature, which she did. She had a lady in Ponca City, as I recall, made 2 or 3 flags, and she presented them to the legislature, and they selected one.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, why the legislature gave this flag back to my mother, which I do have now in my
The
home.
first one.
The first flag in the state of Oklahoma belongs to Ed Fleming.
Well, now, is that the one with the, like we have now?
It's the flag of today,
Well, that was Louise Fluke.
of Ponca City.
I believe she was a young teacher.
That's right.
Well, she lives in Oklahoma City now and not far from me.
Well, she lived in Ponca City
Yeah,
at that
I think
time, and
so.
the legislature gave this flag to my mother.
And she was a young teacher. And Louise, I wanted to give my son a gift that was different, something that was, that couldn't be bought at every 15-cent counter, but something that would mean something to him as time goes on. And I got Louise to hand paint an original of the flag, and on the back she wrote the story of the flag, of how she conceived it and of the meaning of it, and then a little Kodak picture of her, and it's signed. And I think she got about $20-25 for it, and it's very small. But my son was thrilled to pieces to get that because it was the original. But little does he dream now that the original flag is right here in Enid. I must tell him that.
I own the flag, and I'm going to give it to the State Historical Society someday because that's where it belongs.
Well, yes, it really does. We're planning on, we don't have a tape on Miss Fluke yet. She's never made a tape.
Yes.
I wish that we could get one with your wife also, and Mrs. Fluke.
My wife didn't know her.
She didn't know her.
No, because that happened before we were
But
married.
she was the one who started through the DAR, she started this as the flag for, the demand for the flag.
Well, Ms. Fleming just happened to be chairman of the flag committee, whatever that meant in those days, and that's the reason they appointed her to submit a flag that the state legislature could adopt as the permanent flag of the state of Oklahoma.
Well, she probably was appointed by the legislature then.
Oh, she was.
Uh-huh.
That's right.
Well, that'd be interesting to have her comments on it. After we make Louise
No, now, you're talking about my wife. I'm talking about my mother.
Oh, was it your mother?
It is my mother, not my wife.
I was thinking of your wife.
Oh, no, it is my mother.
No, well, I've got it all wrong.
That was my mother that was chairman of the flag committee.
Uh-huh. Well, that's interesting.
Of the,
Uh, but we're going to make Louise flute next week
are you?
on the tape.
Mhm.
And she'll tell us the story of the flag. And now we'll put it with this
Okay.
and get to the full story on it.
Well, I'm going to give it to whoever it belongs to some of these days, and I
Well,
expect it's a historical society.
Society would really enjoy having it. They were just saying that they had never heard the complete story about it.
Mhm.
And
Well,
even that, they wanted it written, and wanted the story told, but it hadn't occurred to anyone to ask where the original is.
yeah, well, I happen to have it.
Well, that's interesting. We found some old pictures that Mr. Mitchell told us about this morning.
Did
Some
you?
made the first day of the run. His office, which was a tent,
Oh, yeah.
and his partners were standing outside. And, we found some valuable things here in Enid, but I didn't dream we'd find the first flag of
Well, it's here, right out to my home.
Well, you should have it insured.
I've been offered a nice little price for it, but
Well, don't you
I
have.
wouldn't sell it under any circumstances because it doesn't belong to,
No,
it belongs to the state, not to Ed
Oklahoma.
Fleming, really.
It does. It is Oklahoma now.
It
And the
belongs to
meaning
the
of
state.
When the meaning that Louise wrote on the back of this little picture that she drew of it, each color and everything in it has a meaning, and it really makes it have a real impact when you realize just what that flag does mean to you then, and what it was meant to be. I must tell Clarence that he can see the original if he'll go over and visit
Yeah.
you. He has a little picture
I've
like
got it.
this that he's so proud of. It's going to take the shine off of him. Do you have anything further that you could add about the early days of Enid? Some interesting happening, or have you had any interesting cases legally, or
Anyway,
any interesting cases legally? Nearly every town has one or two of its.
no, I don't recall any legal
Enid
cases.
has always pulled together pretty well, hasn't it?
I don't recall any of those. I expect Mr. Mitchell could give you a better idea on that than I could.
Well, he told me about some turkeys. It was about the oldest thing.
Is that so?
And trying a man for loss of 7 or 8 turkeys, I believe.
Oh, we lived on chickens and turkey and quail and prairie chicken.
Yeah.
We did a lot of hunting in those early days. We ate a lot of, as I say, we ate a lot of quail and we ate a lot of pheasant, turkeys.
Then you could just go out and get them.
You could just go out and shoot them anytime we wanted to, and we didn't have to go very far.
Well, my pet peeve is they killed off the prairie dogs.
The prairie dogs, have they?
Yes, that's my earliest recollection of those little cute little prairie dogs.
Well, you don't see them anymore, that's true.
No, see, they're gone. Well, we'd love to have a story now, a real good story about either your family or some of your early days here in Enid, or a school incident, or anything you want to tell us about. What kind of transportation did you have?
Transportation?
Surrey with a fringe on top?
Surrey with a fringe on top, and just the old horse and buggy, and of course I had a pony when I was a kid, and
Yeah.
all the boys had ponies. But I don't recall exactly anything else other than I've given you that would be much interest to you.
Well, it's been interesting. finding the flag is something.
I hope the interview has been interesting
Oh, it
because,
has been. And thank you so much.
well, you're entirely